Thanks, Kathleen, and thanks, Andy, and thank you all for being here. I'm Joan Javier-Duval, Jared's wife, and I've known Jared for over 15 years. We've been married for 10 and a half years. Our son, who is now 8 and a half, is also here today. He's selling some lemonade, in fact. Yeah, he's got his... He'd love if you'd come and see him at the lemonade stand. And it's been such a joy to live in Montpelier and be part of the Central Vermont community for the past 8 years or so. The first thing that I want to say about Javier-Duval is that I don't know anyone who loves Vermont and is as dedicated to public service as Jared. Jared and I first met in Washington, D.C. where we were both 20-somethings trying to do some good in the world in our own ways. And from day probably 2 of knowing Jared, I knew that he wanted to eventually move back to Vermont. It's where his heart really was. And it took us 7 years to get back here. And during that time, we would visit pretty often. We would usually come up to his dad's place in Waits River Village near West Topsom. Maybe some of you know where that is, off of Route 25 between 302 and Bradford. And this was my first introduction to Vermont, Waits River Village. I grew up in Chicago and had mostly lived in big cities, so you can imagine this was pretty rural, different kind of life. Jared took great pleasure in showing me his favorite spots in the area, the Fairleigh Palisades, the Whippy Dip for Creamies, the drive-in movie theater. I went deer hunting a couple times with Jared and his dad, Bill, a couple different times over those 7 years. And I can tell you that we had some really nice drives. We ate some good diner breakfast. There was one year that they came back with the deer and hung it up in Bill's barn. It was clear from all of these visits that Jared relished this time in Vermont, doing some of his favorite things. We take a lot of trips to antique markets, and Jared would and still does take pleasure in finding just the right item to bring home. "Isn't this beautiful?" he'd say. It was clear that who Jared was had been shaped tremendously by the hills and the valleys and the rivers of Vermont and the traditions of rural Vermont life. These visits also showed me how devoted Jared is to family, biological and chosen. This is true for the family that we have here in Vermont and also for my family, most of whom are in Chicago. As a parent, Jared takes great joy in passing on his love of time in the woods, antique shopping, watching baseball to our son, as well as this same commitment and devotion to family and to community. Jared shows up out of love and duty for any community that he's a part of. I saw this time and again here in Vermont with family, our different graduate school communities that we are part of, all the different places that we lived. Showing up and being there matters a lot to Jared. And I have no doubt that he would put his all into showing up for you, the voters and constituents of the district, should he be elected. Jared is also one of the most intellectually curious people I know, someone who is devoted to rigorous critical thinking. He wants to understand the issue at hand. He's committed to seeking the truth and the facts and making decisions and judgments from there. He's devoted much of his adult life to honing this thinking, especially around matters of public policy, while also keeping his feet on the ground and his heart close to the people who he knows will be affected by these policies. There are lots of other things I could say about Jared, like how much he loves baseball and the Red Sox, how infuriatingly unbeatable he is at Scrabble, and that he's the kind of guy who will drive 3.5 hours to hear his favorite country bluegrass artist live in concert. I am tremendously excited that Jared is running for state senate. I wholeheartedly believe that he is someone we need. His sincerity, his commitment, his thoughtfulness in this legislature. And I am so pleased now to have him introduce himself to all of you and to tell you why he's running in the Democratic primary. Here is Javier-Duval.